Hi there, my name is James Delabozic, and this is a recording of my presentation given at PIA 2023 at the Symposium. Is NATO ready for 35,000 feet? This is a high altitude parachuting capability assessment. During this presentation, I'll give an overview of the capability and the environment, talk about the physiology review to get everybody on the same page so we can discuss some important topics. We'll talk about how we assess and assume physiological risks and discuss some high altitude parachuting gaps. So myself, I'm a veteran of the Canadian Armed Forces. I did 22 years, some of that as a medic and the rest within the aviation physiology trade. I was also responsible for the creation from the ground up for the Canadian High Altitude Airdrop Mission Support Program. That's in respect to the oxygen equipment, human factors, SOPs, and oxygen support. I was a military freefall parachutist, military diver, hyperbaric chamber operator and safety supervisor, as well as I'm a CSPA B-level parachutist. I have a number of training programs completed within depot level maintenance for high pressure oxygen systems, and I'm a PADI scuba diving instructor. So here's the big statement I want you guys to focus on as we go through each slide. Now this statement is the same for military and civilian parachuting alike, as military physiology standards trickle down to the current civilian activities. So I really want you to think about, are the risks simulated in testing the same as being assumed during operations? And are we really accepting risks that we truly don't understand? Now, as we go through this presentation, the game plan is to build a base of aviation physiology in order to get everyone on the same page. Then we'll discuss how the aviation mask-on community conducts mask-on exposures. And lastly, we'll compare these procedures to what's happening now in the parachuting communities with respect to human factors protection. Now, using this knowledge, we'll highlight some proposed capability gaps and solutions for the community. So these are the questions that I'm asking the community. Number one, how important is qualitative mass seal assessment? Number two, how do we define proximity to operations in hyperbaric chambers or hyperbaric oxygen? What methods and training modalities should we update to better train our high altitude parachutists for their exposure? And lastly, should we call for an update to military standards for the protection of high altitude parachutists above 13,000 feet? Declarations: I have no conflict of interest concerning this lecture, and I'm presenting on my own accord. So let's get into it. Now, when we talk about high altitude parachuting, we're going to focus on two main types: HAHO, high altitude high opening, and HALO, high altitude low opening. Now, high altitude high opening, really its design is to get maximum standoff or distance away from the drop zone. With high altitude low opening, it's maximum free fall distance, usually above the drop zone. Now, these are just two different ways to get to work. Each one has their operational place. Now, HAHO is the more difficult scenario when it comes to planning, and it holds the highest risk. As you can see, because we have that maximum standoff, we're going to have an extended exposure to altitude. So we're going to focus on this type of jumping for the presentation. So where do we conduct high altitude parachuting? Well, we focus on operating in the troposphere. So that takes us up to about the commercial airline routes. So we look at about 13,000 to 35,000 feet. The big takeaway here is to remember that as you ascend at altitude, total atmospheric pressure decreases. In fact, there's a 33% pressure drop between 13,000 and 35,000 feet. So what's in the atmosphere that we breathe? Well, it's made up of about 21% oxygen, 78% nitrogen, and 1% other gases. And the total atmospheric pressure that's around us is really just made up of the sum of its parts. So no matter where you are in altitude, it's always going to be 21% oxygen, 78% nitrogen, and 1% other gases. So to better illustrate that, I have a graph. So on this graph on the left-hand side, you can see the pressure measured in millimeters of mercury. On the bottom, we have our altitude in feet. And on the top, we have green for the partial pressure of oxygen, blue for the partial pressure of nitrogen, and red for those other gases. So at 10,000 feet, you can see that we have a partial pressure of about 110 millimeters of mercury. So at ground level, we like to breathe about 160 millimeters of mercury of pressure. So that being at a sea level pressure of total atmospheric pressure of 760 millimeters of mercury, 21% of that is 160. This is where we evolved. This is where we designed ourselves to be able to breathe oxygen. At 10,000 feet, we're already 32% less than that of sea level for partial pressure of oxygen. Once we get to 18,000 feet, as that atmospheric pressure decreases as we ascend in altitude, we're at 50% less partial pressure of oxygen. When we get to 25,000 feet, we're 63% less pressure of oxygen, and really we're hitting this minimum point of to be able to efficiently get the pressure of oxygen from our lungs into our bloodstream. This is where it comes into the physiological incidents that can happen with aviation, that being hypoxia and decompression sickness. Hypoxia being in a reduced atmospheric pressure inhibits the ability for oxygen to diffuse into the lungs and therefore be utilized by the body. In decompression sickness, reduced atmospheric pressure that causes the inert gas of nitrogen, which is normally dissolved in the body fluids and tissues, to come out of solution and form bubbles. So, like we said, hypoxia is a state of oxygen deficiency in the blood, tissues, and cells sufficient to cause impairment of body function. Like we said before in that graph, at sea level, it's about 160 millimeters of mercury, and that's what we're designed to breathe. So as we ascend in altitude, we require a little extra oxygen. So military regulations state at 10,000 feet, all aircrew must utilize supplemental oxygen. At 13,000 feet, parachutists must utilize supplemental oxygen. When we think about supplemental oxygen, really all it is just trying to get the pressure of oxygen within our lungs back to as close to that sea level pressure as possible so we don't have that oxygen deficiency. So how do we transfer oxygen and how does hypoxia work? Well, you need to understand diffusion, and all diffusion is an area of higher concentration moving to an area of lower concentration, a pressure gradient. So if we take a look at the picture here, we have the chain of oxygen as it moves to our tissues and how that byproduct of carbon dioxide makes its way back up again. So at sea level, we inhaled ambient air, which has about 160 millimeters of oxygen. It diffuses from our lungs into our bloodstream simply through that pressure gradient. Our lungs have a higher concentration of oxygen. Our bloodstream has less of a concentration of oxygen. Then it goes from our blood to our tissues. Same thing again. Higher concentration of oxygen in our blood, lower concentration of oxygen in our tissues. Gets into our tissues, into our cells. We use that oxygen for whatever metabolic process we want to do. As a byproduct, we then have carbon dioxide, and through the reverse, makes its way back to our lungs again. Our tissues now have more carbon dioxide than our blood, so it diffuses over to our bloodstream. Our lungs have a less concentration of carbon dioxide than our blood now, so then it diffuses into our lungs, and then we breathe it out. And this happens 12 times a minute, 365 days a year. So as we ascend in altitude, all that happens is that that pressure gradient gets less and less and less. This area of higher concentration and area of lower concentration get closer and closer together until we can no longer effectively diffuse the oxygen from our lungs into our bloodstream, and therefore giving us hypoxia. Let's talk about decompression sickness next. Now, decompression sickness is a nitrogen problem. Now, nitrogen is an inert gas. We don't do anything with it. All we want to do is keep the same amount of nitrogen or the same partial pressure inside our body as outside of our body. And by breathing in and out, that's how we do it. Now, when we ascend to altitude, all of a sudden, because atmospheric pressure decreases and thus the partial pressure of nitrogen does as we go up, now we have more nitrogen locked inside of our body than the surrounding atmosphere. but simply by breathing, we're able to off-gas this excess nitrogen. Now, with rapid reduction in atmosphere, say going up to altitude on an aircraft, decompression sickness can occur simply when we've overcome the ability to naturally off-gas this nitrogen. And this risk begins at about 18,000 feet. Let's take a look at a video to better illustrate this. All right, so we have our jumper. Now remember, DCS is a nitrogen problem. Nitrogen's an inert gas. All we want to do is keep the same inside as outside. So as we breathe, that's exactly what we're doing, and you can see that in this video. Now when we go to altitude, like I said, atmospheric pressure decreases. So does the sum of its parts. So now the partial pressure of nitrogen outside of your body is less than that as inside of your body, as illustrated here. No problem, because we just breathe it off, or off gas. The problem comes though when we can't off gas fast enough. Well, that nitrogen has to go somewhere. So what happens is it comes out of solution in the form of bubbles and can travel throughout your body, causing a number of different issues. So if you'd like to know more about hypoxia or you'd like to know more about DCS, please use the QR code and it'll take you to my LinkedIn page where I've done some features on both of these physiological incidents that can happen at altitude. Next, let's talk about how we protect ourselves from hypoxia and DCS. Well, the first way is through training. So both the NATO STANAG and the AFIC define the minimum standards that have to be taught to anybody that's going to be exposed to those altitudes. So there's prescribed lessons, things like aviation physiology, equipment familiarization. And secondly, there's some practical training, so hypoxia recognition training. Now, this can be done a number of different ways. It can be done at ground level using normal baric hypoxia, which uses mixed gases to simulate being at altitude. We can use hyperbaric chambers to actually simulate being at those altitudes simply by using a vacuum pump. Or lastly, we can use HAHO, which is a combination of both of those things. Personally, when I'm training high altitude parachutists, I like to use a combination of virtual reality and normal baric hypoxia. This allows me to simulate physiological incidents that might happen within the aircraft in the virtual reality space, as well as simulate from the exit of the aircraft and the canopy descent. Because keep in mind, once you get out of the aircraft, you still have a risk of hypoxia and decompression sickness. So we train our parachutists that if you experience hypoxia under canopy, as a team, you need to be able to deal with that situation in the air. And number two, that those symptoms will get better over time, but it is going to take some time. Another way we can protect ourselves is pre-breathing. So by breathing 100% oxygen via orofacial mask for a prescribed amount of time, it gives us a % of incidence of decompression sickness or a level of protection. The way it works is it's early elimination of nitrogen or washout to give us extra time at altitude. Now, usually it should be completed without interruption for its full and predicted effect. Now, there are a number of studies out there that shows that there can be a break in pre-breathe for a specific amount of time. But end of the day, if we break our pre-breathe too long, we're going to have to restart the whole process over again. Let's take a look at this video to better illustrate pre-breathing. So, like we said, we have our jumper at 16,000 feet. 100% oxygen is used to aid in the early off-gas of nitrogen to give us a head start when we're going to altitude. Now, remember, this is a level of protection and not prevention. As you can see, by pre-breathing with 100% oxygen, it allows us to off-gas that nitrogen early to give us a head start. But remember, this has to be below 16,000 feet for maximum effectiveness. But remember, DCS is still a risk even with a perfect pre-breathe. a sample jump profile of what it would look like doing a jump to high altitude. So on the left-hand side, we have the altitude in feet. On the bottom, we have our duration in minutes. This will be a jump to 25,000 feet, which means we have to do a 30-minute pre-breathe below 16,000 feet. As we cross through 16,000 feet, this is when our exposure time starts. We get to our top altitude, conduct the jump, and do our canopy descent down to 10,000 feet. This red line here represents our exposure time. Because we did a 30-minute pre-breathe below 16,000 feet, it gives us a maximum of a 60-minute exposure with an incident rate of less than 10% for DCS. No more? Head to this link at the QR code to find more about pre-breathing. So, end of the day, the best way to protect ourselves from physiological incidents is by equipment. So we can use an orofacial mask that delivers oxygen. The Air Force, you can use the Gentex MBU-20P that connects directly to a narrow panel regulator, that being in the seat itself, on the dash of the aircraft. Provides supplemental oxygen. Like we said before, aircrew have to have supplemental oxygen at 10,000 feet, parachutists at 13,000 feet. At 18,000 feet, we need that 100% oxygen to be able to artificially bump up the pressure of oxygen within our lungs, close to that 160 millimeters of mercury where we're most efficient. And lastly, above 18,000 feet, we're going to have to do a pre-breathe that begins below 16,000 feet for a prescribed amount of time for a percentage of protection. So how do we fit this gear properly? Well, in discussion with Gentex, the big takeaway here is that the helmet has to be a stable platform. The helmet sets the stage for the mask seal. Without a mask seal, ambient air is then permitted to leak into the mask, thus decreasing the effectiveness of the equipment. The angle of mask attachment is also critically important for the seal. Now, Gentex states that the MBU-20P mask is designed to fit the 97th percentile of user populations. But this is only when using Gentex equipment mixed with it and using the proper fitting and sizing guidelines as directed by the OEM. In fact, sizing is so important that when Gentex went to sell this product to Korea, they had to redo their entire sizing calculations simply because of the demographics of the South Korean population. Next, we need to test this equipment to make sure that it's actually functioning properly. So Gentex provides some equipment testing equipment that tests valve function, communication function, and of course mask seal to give you a qualitative standard stating that for sure this equipment is functioning. In fact, the United States Air Force regulates that all aircrew life support equipment must be tested before any mask on flight as part of the pre-flight preparations. Would you like to know more about aircrew life support equipment? Head to this link with the QR code, and there's a couple studies there that talk about how it works and how it can protect us. Lastly, we have these pesky human factors, things that we have little control over. First off, equipment fitting. So protection is only as good as the equipment fitting. If there's leaks in the mask due to individual human factors, well, protection is going to be less. Our time at altitude. The longer a member stays at that altitude, the greater their incidence of DCS. Slower rapid decompression increases the onset time of hypoxia and DCS. Pre-breathing, well, effectiveness equals the duration plus the altitude plus equipment fit and function. All of these things put together then give us our protection from decompression sickness. Physical activity is proven to significantly increase the incidence of DCS when conducting during the exposure. And during the pre-breathe, it's shown that physical activity can increase the effectiveness of the pre-breathe. Well, dehydration pretty much makes sense that if you have less solution in your body, it's going to be less efficient to transport that oxygen and less efficient to move it around. And lastly, your physical fitness comes down to just simply your base metabolism. Carbon monoxide exposure, well, carbon monoxide has an affinity to the hemoglobin 250 times more than that of oxygen. So if you can think your hemoglobin like little trucks that go around in your bloodstream, these trucks carry oxygen. Each truck has about 4 spots. The problem with carbon monoxide is it sticks to these spots, and all of a sudden now we have less transport capacity for oxygen. Carbon monoxide exposure can come from smoking, exhausts, a number of different routes. And diving before flying. Because when we dive, we go under pressure, we're forcing more oxygen into more nitrogen into our system, which means when we come to the surface, we already have a higher nitrogen load, and by going to altitude, we're going to have incidence of DCS at a much lower altitude. To know more about DCS incident factors, head to the link attached to this QR code to find more. So, end of the day, we've talked about why we conduct high altitude parachuting. We talked about some of the risks, hypoxia and DCS. And lastly, we've talked about the protection of hypoxia and the protection from decompression sickness. Now, this equipment and procedures only work as advertised if you have a good mask seal, that the mask has been sized, fitted, and tested as per OEM specifications. If you don't do that, you risk ambient air leakage and therefore an increased risk of decompression sickness and hypoxia. Next, let's talk about how we assume and assess risk. We'll talk about risk assessment. We'll talk about how we treat decompression sickness. We'll talk about some of the regulations that talk about how we conduct high altitude parachuting, and then a quick case study to give you an idea how we would employ it. So, first way we can conduct a risk assessment, the US Air Force has a product called the ADRACT, the Risk Assessment Computer. Now this first model was completed in 1996, and it was based over 5,000 chamber exposures. How it worked is by taking a look at these chamber exposures and any incidents of decompression sickness that happened during them, they're able to statistically build a bubble growth model. Now that bubble growth model can be affected by the altitude you go to, how long you're at that altitude, what kind of pre-breathing you did, and your level of exercise at that altitude. But it's important to note that the ADRACT was based on in-chamber exposures. It was not based on operational exposures. Remember that anybody that went into the hyperbaric chamber as part of this study had a proper mask seal test and verified. They were wearing proper equipment matched with proper helmets to give immediate protection. Last thing, the in-flight incidents did not take account any delayed onset of decompression sickness, only ones that happened right in the chamber. NASA has their own pre-breathing guidelines. Now, they had some studies that were completed and ongoing as of 2016. The reason why is spacesuits needed increased mobility, meaning the suits were no longer pressurized all the way to sea level. So now astronauts had an increased risk of decompression sickness. So what happened is it decided that the cabin pressure of the spacecraft would be set to an equivalent of about 16,000 feet. And the exposure the astronaut received when they went outside of the aircraft within the suit was about equivalent to 30,000 feet. Because of this new operational capability, NASA decided that they needed to keep their incidence of DCS below 15%. The only way they were able to do this was strict dressing guidelines and procedures, coupled with strict pre-breathing guidelines. So how do we treat decompression sickness? Well, our first line, of course, is recompression. So either recompressing the aircraft or bringing somebody back down to ground level. Next, we apply 100% oxygen via non-rebreather mask, something with a very good seal, delivering at least 15 liters per minute. And it's shown that it gives about an 80 to 90% success rate for treating altitude-induced decompression sickness. Now, for the other 10 to 20%, we need to use hyperbaric oxygen treatment. Now remember, hyperbaric oxygen treatment is characterized as the only definitive treatment for decompression sickness. Now, how it works is basically you're breathing oxygen under pressure, using strict profile guidelines, and slowly bringing you back up to the surface again with a controlled nitrogen off gas, utilizing air and 100% oxygen. Would you like to know more about DCS treatment? Head over to the QR code and you can get more information about how that works. So the international standards that define how we conduct high altitude operations falls within the STANAG, STANAG 7056, which was released in 1996-1997. The custodian is the Netherlands, and the AFIC, so the Air and Space Interoperability Council, through ASM 4040, edition 1, version 2. The custodian for that is New Zealand. So let's take a look at a case study to give you an idea of how we might employ high altitude parachuting. So like I said, today we're going to conduct a short case study to demonstrate the nature of operational high altitude parachuting. Now let's keep in mind that the insertion method is just how the team gets to work. The job still needs to be completed when they hit the ground. For this example, we have a fictional mission to insert into Chad. Now I'll provide a basic mission briefing, and then we'll focus on the medical instructions based on the physiological risks of high altitude. Now this is a fictional case study, and any familiarity with real-life events is entirely coincidental. The locations are real to permit real-time medical evacuation. The takeaway from this case study is to show that the availability of hyperbaric oxygen is very different between training and operations. So our mission is to conduct a covert insertion into N'Djamena, Chad. Now, due to the ground, precision parachuting is the preferred insertion method. The team will be based out of Akateri, Cyprus, which is about a 4-hour and 40-minute flight time. Now, once the objective's been cleared, the team will exfil to a staging area outside of N'Djamena, where they'll be evacuated via airlift to a UN compound in Juba, South Sudan, with a flight time of about 3 hours. Now, the insertion method is high altitude, high opening position parachuting. We're going to exit at 25,000 feet, 20-kilometer canopy flight to the drop zone, which is about 24 kilometers from the objective, under the cover of darkness. We're going to conduct a 30-minute oxygen pre-breathe before ascending through 16,000 feet mean sea level. This will give us an exposure time of 60 minutes. That is from the time our bodies ascend through 16,000 feet and come back down through 10,000 feet mean sea level. The longer the exposure time, the further we risk increasing our incidence of DCS and hypoxia. We're looking at about a 60-minute exposure time based on our 30-minute pre-breathe. Now, once the objective has been met, the team will exfil via ground vehicle to the reception area, which is about 46 kilometers by road, or a 2-hour drive time. So, regarding physiological risks with high altitude insertions, the team needs to be concerned with hypoxia and decompression sickness. Now, how do we ensure we have effective planning for definitive care when conducting operations in austere locations? This is the big question. Take a look where these risks are. Now, as per the risk assessment planning, using established pre-breathing guidelines, we'll keep our planned incidence of DCS below 10%. On the infill, hypoxia may occur due to poor fitting equipment or failure. Team members will identify any signs and symptoms of hypoxia to be assessed and treated with 100% oxygen. Signs and symptoms of DCS will be reported immediately, and team members will be treated with 100% oxygen. Under canopy, hypoxia may occur due to poor fitting of equipment or failure. Team members follow local SOPs, and signs and symptoms should improve during the canopy descent. DCS symptoms may persist throughout the canopy descent and may still be present at ground level throughout the mission. Signs and symptoms of DCS may not present until hours after the original exposure, up to 12 hours. Ground level oxygen, 100%, is the preferred field method for treatment for no less than 2 hours. But hyperbaric oxygen still is the definitive care for decompression sickness. Hypoxia will be treated with 100% oxygen, and team members will be assessed for a full recovery. DCS will be treated on scene with 100% oxygen at ground level for a minimum of 2 hours. Team members will be assessed frequently for the resolution of symptoms. The team medic will update higher medical authority to assess the need for hyperbaric treatment. Hyperbaric treatment facilities have been assessed on the following standards: certification, hours of operation, access to dive medicine specialists, and location of the chamber to permissive environments. To know more, you can get this full case study at the QR code. In addition to what you've already seen, we give some options on how we would treat from this location and the evacuation times that might be involved. So we've talked about qualitative mass seal assessment and how that's completed in the United States Air Force or anybody using the MBU 20P. Now, there are a number of systems out there that use the Gentex MBU 20P as the base of their model, i.e. the silicone that's touching the face of the person. Now that mask, like we said, is designed to fit the 97th percentile for protection from hypoxia and DCS when fitted using Gentex or OEM manufacturer specifications. Once you start mixing the mask with different helmet systems, how can you really say that you're getting to the 97th percentile when, number one, you can't really test the mask for mass seal because for most parachutist oxygen equipment, there's no way to be able to do it. And number two, by using an unauthorized or untested helmet system, how do you know that you're getting that stable platform to attach the mask? Next, we talked about hyperbaric chamber proximity to operations and really illustrated the difference between training and operations. Unfortunately, a lot of people think training in these scenarios, not the difficulty during austere location operations to get somebody to hyperbaric treatment. We talked about some updated methods and training modalities, how we can't train parachutists the same way we train aircrew because the jobs are completely different. And lastly, we talked about how we can update the military standards for protection of high altitude parachutists greater than 13,000 feet. So in parachuting, we have standards from 1996. A mask we can't verify we have a seal and isn't fitted as per the manufacturer's specifications. Helmets that were never designed to attach an aviation mask. Yes, I'm talking about chin straps and mask straps. We have a risk assessment product that's not based on operational exposures. Jumpers who are sedentary during pre-breathe with restrictive straps and equipment. An extreme high level of activity during the actual exposure and hours of a high level activity afterwards. We treat decompression sickness with ground level oxygen in the field with no way of really carrying that level of oxygen supply to be able to actually do it. And no regulations for how far hyperbaric chamber support should be available during operations and how to transport that patient. All of these lead to an increased risk of DCS and hypoxia. So, what can we do? Well, most commercial parachute oxygen equipment do not have a method, simply by their design, to confirm a mass seal. Now, keep in mind, this mass seal we've already found out is incredibly important to protect us from hypoxia and DCS, and it only becomes more important when operating at higher altitudes and conducting pressure breathing. Now, in my discussions with Gentex, they're willing to work with industry and user groups to help solve this issue. Next, operational units prefer to jump with only their ground-based helmet simply because they don't want to carry a second helmet all the way down, and it makes perfect sense. Unfortunately, only testing on these systems for use has been at the individual customer level. How can you have confidence in a mass seal when you don't have a stable platform? And we know that these helmets do not have a stable platform because it's based on the chin strap position on the chin. To wear an O2 mask, you either have to have the chin strap underneath your chin or over top of your O2 mask. Neither of these are optimal. Now, Galvian, who represent the Revision brand, are more than willing to work with industry and user groups in order to work towards a solution. Next, let's talk about hyperbaric chamber proximity to operations. Now, we know through studies that EVAs, high altitude parachuting, high altitude aviation come with a tangible DCS risk. So why are there no regulations stating how close hyperbaric oxygen therapy needs to be to these operations? When we take a look at military diving, there's some very defined points in the regulations that state, depending on the depth of your dive, is how much in hours hyperbaric chamber oxygen or hyperbaric oxygen needs to be. Now, operational military parachuting occurs in austere locations that's usually dislocated from hyperbaric chamber facilities, and there's a lot of terrain in the way to try and fly somebody there through an air evac, so new considerations there, which all of this leads to a delay in treatment. Now, yes, we can use ground level oxygen to treat it, and that really is our first quiver in our first arrow in our quiver. But there's still a 10 to 20% risk for the requirement of hyperbaric oxygen. When I was building this program, it sure would have been nice to have some sort of rule stating how close we needed hyperbaric oxygen. We can get that through a consensus through the NATO medical community to establish a threshold or golden hours for treatment. Next, let's talk about updated methods and training modalities. So, risk assessment models. Models and validation studies were completed using hyperbaric chambers. United States Air Force aerospace physiology staff were ensuring that all the participants had a mask seal and were using approved helmet system and were tested through qualitative standards. As we now know, this doesn't compare at all to what we're doing in parachuting because we're not doing any of that. So those models assume that all humans exposed to altitude are protected from ambient atmosphere, that they all have a mask seal. But if we're not testing for a mask seal, how do we know that parachutists actually have one? Well, we talked about extravehicular activity with NASA. We talked about the fact that the cabin altitude of the spacecraft is about 16,000 feet, which is very similar to where we're conducting our pre-breathing, and that the atmosphere within the spacesuit is equivalent to about 30,000 feet, which is also where we're operating. So NASA is researching human physiology limitations with exposure to reduced atmospheric pressure and increased workload because they do have an increased workload and they are going to be doing back-to-back exposures. So keep in mind, the maximum operational parachuting altitudes are very similar to what NASA is doing right now. So it'd be great to be able to use some of those studies to really compare what we're doing in parachuting versus what is being done in aviation. Next, NATO standards, AFIC standards. So the Standard 7056 was released in about 1996, which means it's outdated. It's not inclusive of any physiology training. That's in a completely other standard. And it really doesn't take into account the current operational equipment. Now, there was an update to that was released in 2018 called AAMEDP 1.18. But it was retracted in about 2019-2020, which left a huge vacuum into the community and brought us back to this Standing 7056 from 1996. I'd like to think we're doing things a little bit differently than we were in 1996, other than maybe still wearing Doc Martens. The custodian is the Netherlands, and it really just comes down to the operational community to talk to NATO and establish a working group on these guidelines. Next in AFIC, which falls under the Five Eyes with US, Canada, UK, Australia, and New Zealand, Air Standard 4040, which is a completely separate standard from Standing 7056, doesn't mirror Standing 7056. So being a Canadian, how do I hold myself to one standard or the other standard? Why aren't they the same? The custodian of this is New Zealand. Here's a list of all the references I used to put together this presentation. These are all open source and unclassified. You can find them all on the internet, so feel free to look them up and take a look on how they work. Lastly, contacts. So first off, if you have questions about how you can better incorporate masks that are based off the MBU-20P design, you can contact Gentex at that email address there. For questions how to better integrate this equipment with operational helmets, go ahead and contact Galvian, who holds the revision brand. I discussed these issues with Dr. Alex Garbino at NASA. Also discussed these issues with Dr. Joan Sari at DRDC. And lastly, Dr. Sherry Ferguson at Simon Fraser University. Lastly, go ahead and contact Ronnie Heumann at Vertez.io. Ronnie does a lot of interesting work with parachute and virtual reality, and this is the program I was using to conduct hypoxia recognition training with my parachutists. I'd like to thank you for your time and hope that you can take this information, take it to your chain of command, take it to industry. We can do better with how we protect our parachutists, and this is how we do it, by championing safety. Thank you very much.